Caskey, thanks for taking the time to join me today.
No problem.
I want to sort of jump in with an observation and a question. So you've done in your research quite a bit of work with what we might call the cultural collision between the Tlingit people of
Alaska.
You're a member of the tribe, and the European culture, and I guess you're a member of that tribe as well, right? Yeah, and so historically, I mean, the story is fascinating, and I kind of had this naive view, right, that these sorts of cultural collisions are traumatic when two groups of people are very far apart. But when I read your work, it occurred to me, maybe I had this backwards. Both the Tlingit people and the Russians, the people of first contact, had highly developed cosmologies and political systems and concepts of property. And so I'm wondering, given all of these cultural collisions in the world, could it be the case that when two people actually are close together, the collision is more traumatic than when they're, in fact, very far apart?
It could be. That's an excellent question. One I had never considered, and I gave it some thought. I think there's something to that. So the Tlingit tribe of Alaska, when the Russians came, the first contact was in the 1740s, but really the attempt at colonization was in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Here you had a tribe with a pretty strict notion of property. And it wasn't identical to the European notion of property, but it was codified, it was strict, and when they collided, it often ended in bloodshed.
Yeah.
And it might be because of the similarities between the European understanding of property and the Tlingit understanding of property, although there are some differences. The strong notion of what constitutes property, what is property, who owns property, were similar enough to make it a violent episode, at least several violent episodes, violent period.
So the Tlingit have, how should we describe it? They've survived. Would you say they flourished in those 200 years?
Flourished depends on what definition of flourishing you're using. Financially, no, not until recently. Things have gotten better recently. Spiritually, in terms of land and resources as well, it's hard to say they flourished, but they've made tremendous strides over the 20th century.
So they've made their way.
Yeah.
I think of sort of modern America as, we're sort of a culture. I guess maybe it's the culture I grew up in the 60s, right, which was mostly white male. And of course, there was the inclusion, the extension of that culture to Black America, to the empowerment of women, which sort of revolutionized things. But wow, today, American culture is in a sense in collision with Muslim culture, with Hispanic culture, with gay culture, and so we're in this tumultuous time. And is there anything that we can learn from the Tlingit about their experiences, about how culture, if it doesn't flourish, at least it sustains itself, it survives, it makes its way? How might we be making our way?
That's another excellent question, and one of the reasons I think we see a lot of, if you want to call them collisions, clashings, meetings of cultures, is after the Civil Rights Act, right? It allowed, other cultures to flourish up against the mainstream or dominant culture. I think what you can learn from examining Tlingit history or the history of other tribes is the process of give and take, of keeping identity, resisting assimilation, but also taking aspects of that culture, other cultures. So I mean, if you looked at, if you examine Tlingit culture, it was, primarily a fishing, Northwest culture. They were quick to adopt technology that would help them in their endeavors. Fishing, they adopted, they adopted technology for making totem poles, for carving screens. That technology is fantastic, right?
So doing what they were already doing,
yeah,
just in a different,
doing it differently,
way.
or in a more
efficient,
interesting, unique,
right,
creative way, whatever helped them. That's right. The coming of religion, the other institutions, they accepted them to an extent, but tried to navigate what the best parts of this kind of new culture, best parts to take, and still retain some core elements of their culture.
Sure.
And meld them the way they could. And I think and so in America we have all this, all different cultures that are meeting, clashing, if you will. How to combine the best of all these cultures, and kind of eliminating some of the things that are negative of every culture has positive and negatives.
Well, so let's maybe you could give an example. I'm going to kind of put you on the spot. Maybe that's not fair. So,
no, that's fair.
So we have the European culture. We've got this indigenous culture. What is sort of one example of something that the Tlingit held on to, and one thing that they took from the Europeans that was a good thing, a beneficial thing, and what's something, a counterexample, what's something they gave up, and what's something they refused to take? How did that work in kind of a specific way?
Yeah, okay, that's another excellent question. Something they took from, how about this? We'll start with the what I would consider negatives first. Something negative about the traditional Tlingit culture was slavery. Okay. Indigenous slavery was, at least in the Northwest Coast and up through Alaska, was a kind of a cornerstone of the culture. And in Washington State, when Washington State natives signed treaties with the government, part of the treaty said that they had to give up their slaves. And so this is 10 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, which is interesting. Giving up slaves, but America doesn't have to give up slaves in the South right at that time. In the Tlingits, it came later, after the Alaska Purchase in '67, the push towards having them give up their slaves, and they resisted that. And so that was a benefit, that movement in America, the emancipation, the giving up slaves, a good movement, right? And eventually had the Tlingit give up their slaves. So that was
what's something they held on to? So they gave up their slavery. What was one of the things that they clung to that was important?
I would say that a notion of reciprocity and kind of how you treat other people and the environment. So, great for instance, my grandmother would always, anyone who visited her house, she was Tlingit, and anyone who visited her house would leave with a bag of food. And that's kind of, I think that comes from an old tribal tradition, and give food to anyone who's leaving your house. And so this idea that you give to people who are visiting your house, and when you visit their house, they would do the same, this notion of
reciprocity.
Continual reciprocity, yeah, that's a great notion.
So thank you so much for your time, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Jeff.